Okay, so we got through segmentation in the first part of the lecture. Apologize for that being 20 minutes long. I usually don't like them that long, but in order to get them all together, they were. So next, we're going to move on to the environments, right? The environments that that also affect what um, motivates human consumption, right? And what are the drivers that marketing folks use in order to forecast what we will wear and purchase, and just what the trends that are going to develop. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So the next section, we're going to talk about some of those environments, and I'm going to try to break it up into smaller chunks for you this time. Let's start with the economic environment. And in the first part of the lecture, we talked about how the U.S. We talked about what the fashion industry does for the U.S. and the world economy. So, $380 billion in the U.S. in apparel and footwear sales, and we're into the trillions when we talk about the global economy, effects of the global economy, and local economics. Plays a factor, right? So we have seen again in the change with the pandemic that consumer income is one of the biggest drivers for the economic environment of fashion, and we've had a handful of retail brands or stores that have filed for bankruptcy because the economic environment changed so drastically that they weren't prepared for that change, and definitely wasn't prepared for a sustained change. So in these next few slides, we're going to talk about consumer income and population, and how they directly affect fashion. And the images that we have here, even though the image on the left, she is ornate, right? If we think about emerging economies, and China is an emerging economy, we think about emerging economies as, personal consumer income increases, citizens go from wearing maybe, traditional, or standard, or I don't like to use the word, it's basic, but they move towards a more affluent form of dress. As the first thing that happens when you get some money, whether it's especially unexpected money, right? First thing you do is you like, oh, what can I get to adorn myself to make me look better, right? So we go out and purchase clothes and shoes and handbags. And for emerging economies, they've seen the world, or at least the U.S. population, living in brands, and I put that in my air quotes, right? So they want Levi's and Coach bags and Gucci and Supreme, right? So the economic environment is really important to the overall, environment of fashion. So we talked about how our economic environment really influences what fashion does, not just fashion, what fashion does, what fashion is able to do. So let's look at why, right? And it's because of two things, right? And one is consumer income. And in consumer income, there's two components. It's personal income, so that's just all the income that's received by a population, that whole number that consists of wages and salaries and all other income from all your sources. And then there's disposable income, and disposable income is really an economic driver, because disposable income is the money that you have to spend after you pay all your necessities, after you pay your bills, right? After you pay to keep a roof over your head, food in your belly, your car running, or your Uber, your bus pass, your transportation. So disposable income is, you can't see my air quotes, the fun money, right? So the purchasing power of households, during a quarter, or during a month, a quarter, or a year, is really, it's really driven by this disposable income. And over the last 100 years, the amount of disposable income has it has increased. Disposable and discretionary income can be used, in conjunction. Um, so look at those two definitions in your textbook, because there's a more definitive definition of those two in your textbook, right? But the other thing is the purchasing power of a dollar. So what can you get for a dollar? What is the dollar worth? And over time, unfortunately, the worth of a dollar has greatly diminished. So looking at the graphic at the top, so if we look at $100 in 1913, that what you could get with that $100, that purchasing power of $100 in 1913 is much different than it is, as of today. And in 1913, $100 was a vast amount of money, and $100 barely gets some of us through a week, right? With gas and food and discretionary, those incidental expenses that we have now. Could we get through less than 100? Yes, but for many people, $100 doesn't last them a week, right? Because of that value that you get for your dollar. I know this is a fashion class, but the example that I give, we are bakers. We like bakers. We like to eat at bakers. We're a baker's family, and I tell my kids when I was in high school that I used to be able to get a baby meal at Baker's for $1.06. Burgers, fries, soda, $1.06. And that same baby meal now I think is $6 or something along those lines. But the power of what I could do with $10 in a week as a high school senior is much different than what my high school freshman will be able to do with that same $10. Gas was 99 cents, so I could get enough gas for a couple days, and get 2 or 3 meals, and unfortunately that purchasing power has diminished so much that it puts a financial strain, right? And oddly enough, many consumers have not just not been able, it's impossible to adjust your spending because the dollar isn't worth what it used to be worth, right? So if we look at the chart on the bottom, the average measure of consumer prices was about $10, and now we're down to $1. So our purchasing power just has not grown. It's diminished. So what you could get for $1 in 2016, you would have been able to get 10 of them, right? In 1950. So consumer income is very important in shaping that environment, right? Because if we don't have the funds to purchase, retailers have to make some adjustments, and that's part of the reason why there's been the rise in fast fashion. Fast fashion is, it's inexpensive, it's trendy, but it's also disposable, right? So fast fashion things are never of a high quality and are not intended to have any lasting value. And I have some things in my closet. I have one pair of boots in particular that are 15 years old. They're a pair of Ralph Lauren riding boots that was a splurge at the time that I got them, but they've lasted for 15 years. A classic. I have gotten them resold, and I polish them and all that good stuff. But they're in my regular rotation, and if we were in class, you would have seen them at some point in the semester because they are in my regular rotation. So consumer income is really a big component of the environment of fashion. Because the economic piece of it, if we as consumers don't have the money to buy something, then the companies don't have the ability to sell something. In this slide, we're going to look at population based on age demographics, right? Just on and specifically on generation. So let's look at this, and hopefully you've heard of all these generations. You probably heard of one more than anything else, because poor millennials get the brunt of everybody's hatred. I hate to say it if you're a millennial, sorry. I don't agree with it. But let's look at some population, and look at some population. So, back to the textbook. The textbook talks about the majority of the population has some discretionary income, which is true, and are an influence on fashion, and the size of that population has some influence as well. So that's why these generational influences are important as well, because that determines the mix that a mass market retailer is going to have. So, stores like Macy's and Nordstrom's and even, Target and Walmart, Marshalls and Ross, make their decisions on what they buy based on age demographics too, when they're stores that reach a broad range. So so if you go into Ross and they have the junior section, that's air quotes, and then they have the women's section, right? So what are in those two departments or two areas of the store are completely different based on this age demographic, this age environment. And when we look at the graph on the screen, we see some of the things that are important to each of these generations. So those folks pre-45 to 1960, those maturist and boomer folks, their aspiration was home ownership and job security, right? And folks like me, I even put it in the syllabus. I believe in work-life balance because I'm in that X group, right? Work-life balance. And then the Ys, also known as the millennials, want freedom and flexibility, and everybody else just wants that. The youngest generation wants that security and stability. And when we look at the circle graphics all the way to the right, the unemployment levels of those ages also are important. So we see that the employed workforce for boomers is about 28%, and the unemployed by choice is about 21. And if we look at the Gen Ys and Zs, 50% of those folks are unemployed, and they're unemployed in part because the boomers won't retire, right? They won't retire for a multitude of reasons. Some of them don't want to. They enjoy working. Some of them can't afford to. The recession in 2008 took a lot of their discretionary consumer income away, or actually not even discretionary, just their personal income away, and what they were able to save for retirement. It took away a lot of the equity of their homes. So those things are all important in the economic environment. And when we look at that, if we look at the unemployed workforce, so we look at 50% of Gen Y and 25% of Gen Z are unemployed. Those are people who don't have security and aren't able to necessarily go out and buy a home, right? They are expensive, and the first home that my parents bought, they paid $71,000 for. Now, mind you, it was in 1976, but that was an unbelievable price. And then the home that they bought in the 80s, in the late 80s, they paid about $120,000 for, and now it's valued in the 500s. And I'm not even going to tell you how much the first one that I bought cost, because it was not what my parents paid. All right, so these things are also important in fashion, because if you think about being employed, it affects your personal discretionary disposable income. It affects the luxury items that you're able to buy. It affects the choices that you're able to make, and all of those things are a factor in how marketers and how producers determine what is going to happen in the fashion world.